Welcome everyone to another fun TLN event sponsored by the Library Network. We're here to talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. This is one of two events that will be marking this moment in history, including an in-person event taking place on November 15th at Michigan Technological University in Houghton, Michigan. You can register for that event at tln.org. As we commemorate 50 years since the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, we're here to learn from author and historian Fred Stonehouse, author of over 30 books on maritime history, focusing on Great Lakes, including the best-selling The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Fred Stonehouse remains the expert on this topic, having consulted for both the U.S. National Park Service and Park Canada, along with being the on-air expert for National Geographic and the History Channel. Fred remains the premier expert of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And now I turn it over to Fred.
Thank you. This is going to be fun. Anytime I have a chance to talk to folks about shipwrecks and the big lakes and Great Lake and Lake Superior in particular, it's just a great time and a great opportunity. And I hope you'll enjoy what I'm doing tonight. And with the understanding that I'm, excuse me, taking the program a little differently than I might normally approach it. Spending a little bit less time on telling the story of the Fitzgerald way back than really what happened in the last 50 years. So we're going to be a little different in what you might be expecting, but I think you'll find it very interesting. Before we begin, please understand the bottom of this quote, Gordon Lightfoot. If it weren't for Gordon Lightfoot, we wouldn't be talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald tonight. That much of an impact he had on the situation. But regardless, the Fitzgerald was built in 1958, Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, about 729 feet long. When she came down from the launching ways, she was the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, only rivaled by her sister, the Arthur B. Homer. It wasn't until the big 1,000-footers began coming out in the 1970s that the Fitzgerald was overwhelmed by a larger boat. Throughout her career, she set numerous speed records and cargo records, whether it was the amount of cargo that was delivered every load or the amount of taconite pellets that they were carrying through on a season. It was the Fitzgerald that was invariably number one at the end of the year for cargo hauling. She also was a favorite with the crews. And if you were a sailor on the Great Lakes, you wanted to sail for Columbia Transportation Division of Ogilvy Norton, and you wanted to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald because she was the pride of the line. She was the best maintained vessel in the line. She was getting all of the new things, so to speak. She was the place that you as a sailor could really practice your craft. And again, very desirable posting to be on it. The gentleman in this picture is Edmund Fitzgerald. He was the president of the Northwest Wisconsin Life Insurance Company, and really 6 of his uncles became Great Lakes captains. So he was the only one that did not follow the water. He followed the insurance business and the work of an accountant, really. But in construction, she had 3 cargo holds, all of them non-watertight. We'll take a look at those in a different slide. Ballast tanks are located below the cargo holes and on either side. No watertight bulkheads were used on the vessel beyond the collision bulkhead forward and aft. And that would later become a bone of contention when she was lost. But we'll talk about that when we get a little tighter to that issue. Here's a good illustration of what the design of the Fitzgerald looked like. If you were to lay her up in comparison to a freighter today, there would be very little difference. That was the basis on which she was built and designed, was to carry on the tradition of what they were doing, not necessarily to break new ground. However, she was also built to be fast. Again, delivering cargoes, making money, number of turnaround trips a year, generally coming down from, let's say, Silver Bay in the Minnesota North Shore with taconite pellets to Toledo would be about a 3.5-day trip. Turn around, do it again. Turn around, do it again. Course of the season, about 45 or 46 round trips. Hard duty for a boat to be able to do that. if you were a sailor on the lakes in, let's say, 1940 or so, and you were in the stern of the vessel, and you had to get to the bow of the vessel because it was your turn on watch to be the steersman, let's say, the way you traveled was on the upper deck, on what was referred to as the weather deck of the vessel, right about in here. And the reason for that was because the waves, if they were big, were coming right across the top of the boat. So if you were trying to make it on foot, it would not be unusual to be washed overboard. So the way they prevented that was they put tunnels into the boat or passageways that allowed you to do that under the deck in safety. We'll take another look at those during construction. Again, the vessel, the tunnels that were built for crew safety back and forth. They really a feature that was just beginning to be accepted by the lakes. So from that standpoint, Fitzgerald was a cutting edge on it. She was also cutting edge on module construction. When you built an ore carrier, you traditionally built it plank by plank, sheet by sheet, piece of steel by piece of steel, girder by girder, rivet by rivet. What they did was jump ahead and build sections of the vessel ashore at another place in the yard, and then bring it to the boat and then move it in as a complete piece of the vessel, welding her into position. That was not something traditionally done on the Great Lakes. So from that standpoint, the Fitzgerald was breaking new ground. It was common to be done on the Atlantic and Pacific shipyards, but not on the lakes. Well, she would clear lakes, or yeah, clear Lake Superior. She would clear Superior, Wisconsin, coming down Lake Superior, down Lake Huron, and then end up where the Star is, and the south end of the Straits of Detroit, and at the Zug Island Steelworks. Got to go back a second. Where do we go? There we are. It talks about the amount of pellets being carried, about 27,000 tons of pellets, iron ore pellets. That's enough to make 7,500 automobiles, 1975 vintage. Real cars, big cars, not little Foresters bouncing around the countryside, but really full-size automobiles or trucks. So that was unsurprising. Last trip she would take, she would depart 10 a.m. from Superior, Wisconsin, at the base of that red line. She would make it up to two harbors, about an inch or so up that red line, where she would marry up with another ore carrier, the Arthur M. Anderson, about the same size vessel, a little bit smaller, same basic construction of vessel. And they would convoy together about 10 miles apart. Fitzgerald in front, the Anderson coming in behind her. She would later have another vessel, the Wilfred Sykes, come out of two harbors and get behind the Anderson. So it was almost a train that was now running on Lake Superior. And this was very commonly done. It was a crowded waterway at times, and for the ships to be in sight of one another was, again, part of what the occupation required. At about 10 a.m., both ships rather, would alter course, steering more to the north. The winds have gone north, and what they're trying to do is get under the shelter of the Canadian shore. So they'll steer behind the windbreak of the Canadian shore, then they'll make their turn and head into Whitefish Bay. Seas are running at about 12 feet. Winds would later drop off to about 5 knots. A complete wind shift would occur. 245, those winds would be up to 42 knots. So now you're into gale force. And at this point, Anderson, who was following Fitzgerald, would lose her in the snow squalls that were dancing across the lake. And this would turn out to be a bad storm, but not anything epic. This was not number one on the hit parade of foul weather on Lake Superior, but it was bad, but it wasn't as worse as some of them would later be. But the Anderson would lose track of the Fitzgerald in the snow squalls. She was there, she was on radar, and then she would disappear. Then she would disappear from radar because the radars on the Anderson or Fitzgerald stopped working. They ceased to function properly. At this point, the captain of the Fitzgerald calls back to the Anderson and says, in effect, I lost my radars. Can you keep an eye on me? So by using his radars, he's able to watch the Fitzgerald moving ahead and give any change in direction if any is necessary. The seas at this point are up to 16 feet and rolling down the decks. This illustration just shows where the ships had made their turn on the North Shore and where their general heading was down towards Whitefish Point. and Whitefish Bay, and eventually the Sioux Locks. The winds were so strong, however, that the Mackinac Bridge was closed with 90-mile-an-hour blasts. Sioux Locks closed down with 85-mile-an-hour winds. And just to put that in comparison, anything over 74 miles an hour is considered a Cat 1 hurricane. But there are no hurricanes on the Great Lakes, so the Weather Service does not refer to them as hurricanes, just heavy wind. Even Marquette, a sheltered port, 65-mile-an-hour blasts coming out of the lake. About 4 p.m., the Fitzgerald would speak with an upbound salty, in this case the Avafors. Salty is a term used for vessels that trade salt water. In other words, they're going from, let's say, Duluth with a cargo of grain, perhaps, down the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Atlantic Ocean, crossing the North Atlantic, down to the Mediterranean, where they would unload their cargo and then repeat the process. They had different construction than the Great Lakes freighters did. They were built stronger and tougher to be able to punch their way through the Atlantic storms than on the Great Lakes when you have a different set to the waves, making the salty less desirable on salt water than he would be on rather less desirable on fresh water than he would be on salt water. But in conversation, he's going to relay to the captain of the Fitzgerald, Ernest McSorley, that he's got a bad list. Rather, McSorley is talking to the Avafors, the Swedish vessel, that he's got a bad list, lost both radars, taking heavy seas over his decks in one of the worst seas he's ever been in, and he would lose his fence rail. The fence rail was important because it was the barrier between the open deck and the water. So if you were a sailor working on the boat, the fence rail, quite literally steel stanchions coming up from the deck about every 10 feet, with 3 strands of heavy-duty wire rope running through the outlets on the rail, such that they formed the planking on a fence. So you had a good way to keep yourself from being washed overboard by using the fence rail. That he had broken his fence rail created great consternation, because essentially the only way you can break it is to break the ship. If you take the ship in the middle and break that ship, then that force of that happening will break the fence rail. But why it happened to break this fence rail but not apparently break the ship becomes part of the mystery of the Fitzgerald. About 7:10 p.m., the captain of the Fitzgerald would contact the captain of the Anderson, Bernie Cooper, and in effect let him know that they're holding their own. Last radio communication from the Edmund Fitzgerald to the Anderson was, "We are holding our own." Nothing more said after her. At that point, the ship was quite literally dead for practical purposes. The Anderson and Cooper in his pilot house would keep an eye on all the other shipping that was moving up and down the lakes, and they were ships out moving. But he didn't see the Fitzgerald anymore. He couldn't find the Fitzgerald on radar. He couldn't see him visually. By now, the snow clouds had moved out of the area. The night was bright and clear, though rough and really stormy. But he didn't have Fitzgerald. So he would call the Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, known as Group Sioux, make his report on the missing ore carrier. Incredibly, the fellow that took the radio call was not the least bit concerned about the missing Fitzgerald. He was very concerned in making sure that the Anderson knew there was also a missing 16-foot aluminum boat. Keep an eye for it. It was Cooper who kept his cool, really, in dealing with this young Coast Guardsman who had no idea what was happening, no idea what missing ore carrier meant, no idea what he should be doing with a microphone in his hand during an emergency. But it was Cooper who convinced him to get somebody else more senior. Once that happened, then the Coast Guard began to galvanize into action for the missing boat. They would not find much, and we'll talk about some of the things they did do, but the essence of it was that the Fitzgerald was indeed missing. There was no explanation for it. 4 days later, I make a naval search aircraft, the P-3 Orion, that was used to find used to find Russian submarines. That was their official duty. Participated in the Fitzgerald hunt and managed to locate her in 550 feet of water about 15 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The Coast Guard would be out a few days later with a portable side scan unit, being able to identify the wreckage further and get a better bead on the exact spot on the lake bottom that she's located. But they, of course, only knew what they knew because they had no witnesses to the accident, no witnesses to what occurred, and at this point, no idea what actually happened. Well, the following year, the Coast Guard would issue a report that essentially said that the Fitzgerald was lost. If I can find it here. No, we're going to drop off back and go. My error, gentlemen. The National Transportation Safety Board would take over the responsibility for investigating accidents under the purview of the U.S. Coast Guard. We think of the National Transportation Safety Board today as being something that only does aircraft accidents. Well, they actually have authority for also train accidents, vehicular accidents, any kind of an accident falls under their umbrella. And they would conclude that it was sunk because of the cataclysmic collapse of one or more hatch covers. Those hatch covers were designed to take a 4-foot static head of water. Remember, I keep talking about my wave rolling up the back of the ship, rolling up the open weather decks till they finally hit the pilot house. Well, those hatches that were on the Fitzgerald, the 21 hatches, big steel thing, 7,000 pounds apiece, if you put 4 foot of water on top of the hatch, that was sufficient to collapse the hatch cover. If you happen to have a situation where you had 3 waves combined come across the stern deck and what was known as the Three Sisters, then you would have 12 foot of water on top of the hatch, triple the amount necessary to collapse it cataclysmically. Once you lost the hatch, you lost the boat because at that point the water begins to pour into the cargo hold. The cargo holds are not separated by waterproof bulkheads, a wall. They simply have screens to prevent the movement of cargo easily, the small taconite pellets, but they don't prevent the movement of water. So if you have water in your cargo hold for whatever reason, leaking hatches, for example, that water will migrate to different areas of the ship to the low point and can cause either the ship to heel, to begin to capsize to one side or the other, perhaps put the bow up and the stern down, but certainly all of it very dangerous to the operation of the vessel. So that's what they believed happened at transportation safety. Enough water by 7:15 had entered the cargo hold in the front of the vessel and reduced the freeboard to near zero at number 1 hatch. Freeboard is the measurement of water from the ocean surface, the lake surface, up to the level of the deck. So in the case of the Fitzgerald, in this instance, it was 11 feet. So you are standing on the deck 11 foot above the water. When she was constructed and type classed, in other words, determinations given to her, she had 14 feet of water. So the Coast Guard changed the rules, if you will, after the boat was built for a while and allowed to have less freeboard. So now she was closer to the water and really more vulnerable to any large waves or large seas that would get on top of her deck. That became a significant problem. Piling of seas increasing the effect and again causing the cataclysmic collapse of at least 2 of the forward hatches. I talked the waves of water pounding into the stern of the pilot house. This is the pilot house of the vessel. On the other side of that steel, you're going to find the actual wheels house where the radar is kept, where the ship is steered, et cetera, et cetera. So what you've got is kind of the backside of that cabin. And if the water again rolls up your open deck with enough force and enough volume to it, it is smashing into the back of that pilot house. It's temporarily piling high like a wall of water. When it collapses, it just pounds on top of that cargo hatch and literally knocks it asunder, and then opens up the cargo hole to accept all the water that's swinging around her deck. And they set it up something like this. They said it took about 2 minutes to totally sink. A cargo of taconite. Taconite pellets, little iron ore pellets, will absorb about 7% of their weight in water. So water that's coming into the cargo hold now is being absorbed by the taconite pellets. In other words, it's kind of disappearing. If you were to look, you wouldn't see anything because it's, again, absorption into the pellet. If you had the a pile of taconite pellets, their angle of repose will be about 26 to 30 degrees. So if you do anything that upsets those angles of the pellets, they now begin to run. In other words, the pilot's going to collapse. It's going to go towards the low part of the vessel and will be a problem depending on what situation you're in. But picture yourself in the ore carrier, you're running for Whitefish Point, you're being pounded to death by the seas, you're getting the back of your wheelhouse pounded by these big waves coming up the stern, and the cargo hold is breached, the water is flowing in, the pilot house now begins to sink into the water a little bit, in other words, takes a bow angle down. The vessel itself begins to lose its freeboard, getting closer and closer to that break point on the waves, and you're just trying to hang on. But as that free water in the cargo holds, 1, 2, and 3, begins to migrate forward, now it hits the back of the number one cargo hold. That causes an imbalance in the vessel, so the bow of the boat now goes underwater, the stern comes up, and what you have is a situation something like this. The bow could, figuratively speaking, literally speaking, in fact, be smacked right dab on the bottom, 550 feet down. The stern of the vessel, with a propeller running, could conceivably be out of the water. She's 729 feet long. Certainly a spectacular way to have a shipwreck, but she could have gone that fast and with that deadly effect. Well, the Lake Carriers Association disagreed with both transportation safety and the Coast Guard. The Lake Carriers Association is the industry group. If you own a company, you would be a member of that association, for example. Use it usually for lobbying between corporations and lobbying with the federal and state governments. But at the time, there were 35 companies that were in the Lake Carriers Association with 135 vessels. Today, we're down to somewhere around 56 vessels in Lake Carriers Association, but we're carrying more cargo because you've got those 13,000 footers that are out there, 13 vessels 1,000 feet or larger, that are carrying about 70% of all the steel and iron cargoes on the Great Lakes. So we got bigger, we got more capable, but we have less vessels. So they would issue a counter report. The red line you see is where the Fitzgerald is presumed to have gone by Captain Cooper from the Anderson. Remember, he was the vessel that was following Fitzgerald 8 miles back, 10 miles back, 11 miles back, staying right on station. He's the nearest thing there is to a witness as to what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. The nearest thing to a witness. He claimed that she hit Caribou Shoal. Now, if you look at the end of that red line, right down at the bottom of it, where it says Fitzgerald wreckage, that's a extension of the reefs that are off of Caribou Island. They go north about 2 miles. In reality, they're about 2.5 miles. There was an error made in the surveying of the shoal. So it shows as being smaller than it actually is. In other words, you think you can be off safe, off in the deeper water, when in reality you may not be. So the lake carriers would issue a report too. All this occurring immediately after the wreck. I mean, the ship wrecks in 1975. The initial Coast Guard investigation is 1976. The report is issued in 1977. The lake carriers or the transportation safety comes out in 1978. Lake carriers report follows that out about 1979. So you've got this compilation of documentation in the system. Cooper, again, the captain of the U.S. Steel boat, Anderson, I'm positive he went over that 6 Phantom Shoal, meaning Caribou Shoal. I know damn well he was in on that 36-foot spot, and that if he was in there, he must have taken some hell of a sea. I swear he went in there. In fact, we were talking about it. We were concerned that he was in too close, that he was going to hit the shoal off Caribou. I mean, God, he was about 3 miles off the land beacon. That was a conversation inside the pilot house of the Anderson when they couldn't find Fitzgerald anymore. Well, there's 8 practical theories that have come out of the 50 years since the Fitzgerald sank. The Coast Guard advocating hatch cover leakage. Transportation safety, was the hatch cover collapsing from the weight of the large waves. You might think of them as being a rogue wave. The Lake Carriers Association knows she hit Caribou Island. Paul Hainault, who was an engineering professor from Michigan Tech, for several years had his students, his engineering students, study the Fitzgerald wreck from an engineering perspective to see if they could find the smoking gun to what had happened. They didn't. The fact that she may have had a broken keel. The keel is that steel strut that goes down the base of a ship's hull and acts as the backbone, if you will, of the vessel, the strongest point of the ship on the keel. Some of the naval architects and naval engineers have looked at the prints of Fitzgerald and the specifications and believe that she was built too lightly and that she simply had pounded to death with her quick and long service. In other words, all of the shipping that was done on her, all the records being set, was not good for the long-term health of the vessel. There was a phenomenon on the lakes called Three Sisters. It's an old one going back to commercial fishermen who believed that if you're in a following sea, in other words, the waves coming up your stern, there'll be one wave bigger than the normal wave. Then there'll be a second wave that will be bigger than the first wave, and they will meld together into one big wave. And then there'll be a third one that will be really big, and that will be on top of the other two, and enough water just simply to overwhelm the vessel and to send it to the bottom. The referred to as the Three Sisters. Today, a scientist will look on it more as a rogue wave theory than the glory of a Three Sisters situation. And of course, space aliens. You got to have space aliens or you don't have a theory. These are one of the two lifeboats that were on Fitzgerald. You can see the damage done to the vessel. And you wonder how could that happen in a storm of any kind? Here's half of the number one boat. How did that happen? How did this vessel get torn in half? What they think happened is that because all of the, or rather both lifeboats had air containers built into the boat, flotation tanks, that because the lifeboats were secured to the vessel, when she dove for the bottom, that upward force of the empty air tanks was enough to cause both lifeboats to break loose from the normal lashings to the ship and come speeding northward like rockets, strike part of the Fitzgerald that was either on the surface or was on the way down, and damaged herself by hitting the steel of the ship at relatively high velocity. They were recovered on the north shore of Lake Superior. But now we stop for a minute and you put a little thought into it. Everything we've talked so far has been shipwreck for the Edmund Fitzgerald. But until Fitzgerald sank in 1975, we have had a situation on the lakes where about every 5, 6, 7, or 8 years, we have a major shipwreck. I mean, a major shipwreck. Here's the Daniel J. Morell in 1966, similar vessel to Fitzgerald. She will go down with 28 or 29 men. One single survivor will come off that ship on Lake Huron. Carl D. Bradley, 1958, 33 of 35 men will go down with her, northern Lake Michigan. Cedarville, May of 1965, she'll lose 10 of her crew in a collision with a Norwegian freighter in the Straits of Mackinac. So the shipwreck becomes almost a expected circumstance every again 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Here's another grouping of them. This is Maryland, owned by U.S. Steel. She would be knocked ashore in Marquette in 1953 because she lost her hatches. Because the seas boarding the deck were strong enough and heavy enough to knock loose 3 of the hatches. So it was either go to the bottom or put her on the shoal, and they chose to put her on the sand. Henry Steinbrenner, 1953, up south of Isle Royale, 11 crew of gone out of 31 crewmen. And again, hatches were lost in the heavy weather, and that was enough to lose the entire ship. These were old ships, however. Bradley, 31 years, Morell, 60, Steinbrenner, 53. Fitzgerald was only 17. She was comparatively an adolescent on the Great Lakes and should have had another 50 years in front of her. The last major loss on the Great Lakes is this one. This is the Coast Guard buoy tender Mesquite, and she would be sunk on the rocks December 8th, 1989, through pure negligence. Absolutely stark raving pure negligence did it. But it does count. That's the last shipwreck we've had on Lake Superior and on the Great Lakes of any size. El Faro, special circumstance. This was also U.S. owned, U.S. crewed, U.S. built, U.S. constructed, U.S. registered. She was a container carrier. She was carrying a full load of containers down to Puerto Rico. She would get caught in a Cat 4 hurricane, and she would be gone in the storm, all hands. Coast Guard would spend 4 days looking for her bits and pieces of survivors and gave up after only 4 days. People have asked, especially the family members of the crewmen lost, how come nobody knows about us? How come nobody knows we went down and we sunk and we lost all of our family members that were on board and nobody cares? Comparing that to the Lightfoot song. And they're absolutely right. Fitzgerald had Gordon Lightfoot, and that made the wreck. The El Faro had nothing, and they don't exist. They just kind of went off into the mist of history. Well, the first serious look at the Fitzgerald was done in August of 1989. It was put together as a project by Michigan Sea Grant, National Geographic Magazine, or Geographic Society, Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I was aboard as one of the survey members for this effort. We had brought in a special three-dimensional color video team, video equipment to be able to shoot the wreck with the hope of getting enough footage to be able to show enough experts like naval architects, vessel captains, vessel operators, chief engineers, to be able to see a smoking gun in the video. And we spent a good day with everybody we could find sitting down in the rooms, going through the tape again and again and again, and could find no smoking guns. It still remained a mystery. But this was the last and only legitimate survey done of the wreck. In other words, where you really were looking for something specifically. In July of 1994, there was something called Great Lakes 94. It was an environmental effort to quantify the amount of pollution in the Great Lakes. It was headed up by a Canadian physician, Joe McGinnis. Their problem was that they weren't getting any publicity. Nobody really cared about pollution in the Great Lakes in 1994. They couldn't get any interest in it until they went out to the Fitzgerald and took pictures of the sunken ore carrier. And then at that point, everybody's interested in what they're doing. So they did it for the sex appeal, if you will, not for the legitimate science. Later that year, a private individual, Fred Shannon from Mount Morris, Michigan, would personally pay for a heavy salvage tug, along as a small diving submarine brought in from California, with the effort that he would get enough video footage to put a video together and enough information to do a book. Circumstances were he managed to do neither. It just didn't work out. However, the family members now all this time are agitating. They're agitating for two things: to stop diving on the wreck completely, close it off, make it a graveyard. The Canadians did that. The other thing they did was allow the removal of the ship's bell. To a mariner, to a sailor, the ship's bell really represents the soul of the ship. And to have the bell gave you some closure as a family member. You don't have any remains of your loved one. You don't have a headstone in the cemetery. You don't have a grave. You don't have a funeral. You've really lost all those things that could help you get through this tough spot in your life. But if we had the bell, that would help. So as a result, Shipwreck Society, again, Canadian Navy at this point, also with their dive support ship Cormoran, the heavy-duty diving suit, which was an armored diving suit. You can see it here in this particular picture. Allowed the individuals, the divers, to get down to 500 feet plus and remove the old bell from the ship, replace it with a new bell inscribed with every member of the crew that was on board. That arrow indicates the one thing that we did find at the early survey work that was done. It looks like the pilot house port side door is open, and that's what's underneath that red arrow. It looks like it was left open, and you can almost put in your mind that somebody in the pilot house knew what was going on and was going out that door to try and get rescued himself, try and get out off the ship. Obviously not a reasonable circumstance, but it does imply that. So here's the question. There's a lot of people out there that are still trying to solve the mystery of why the Fitzgerald sank. But nobody is trying to solve the mystery of why are there no more Fitzgeralds? It's 50 years. We haven't had a major shipwreck. We haven't had a shipwreck in 50 years on Lake Superior or the Great Lakes. I mean, a fishing boat once in a while, but an actual functional steel-hulled vessel, none. So why? Why do we have no more shipwrecks? I postulate there's three reasons, the three change agents that were involved. One was industry-driven equipment change. The second was regulatory change, and the third was operator change. That operator change is different and it's important. We'll talk about it. Well, they initially looked at other vessels to check out the idea of it being a structural integrity problem. In other words, is something in the design of the ship? Is it weak material was used? Was it full spec? All of those issues that might cause the ship to break into on the surface, like Fitzgerald may have. So they also managed to strengthen the hatch covers and the hatch coamings, which is the steel work that the hatch sits on. But it was tough. And that ship that I'm showing you was not a Great Lakes vessel. It's one of the ships that was built for World War II, known as the Liberty ship, 445 feet, relatively slow, carried cargo from the home port to the battle location, unloaded it, and went and got more. Very critical item in the war. Why do you think that 2,710 is there? That's the number of ships they built, Liberties. Why do I have 1,500? That's the number of Liberty ships that had significant cracking problems. And why did I have 12? That's the 12 Liberty ships that sank at their dock from being loaded. So cracking, hull failure is not an unusual thing on the lakes or anywhere. For example, this was the Michipicoten Lake freighter that was built back in 1952. This past summer, she was off of two harbors carrying full cargo, and she cracked. She literally had a structural failure 13 feet long in the hull, right at the turn of the hull. If it had been a bad day with a little bit of blowout there, we probably would have lost the ship. As it was, some tugboats were able to get out, get some humps going, get her into temporary safety at Thunder Bay, patched up and brought down to the Lewis Superior for full evaluation. I don't know if she's going to be scrapped out or whether she'll be returned to duty or not, but it is real and it's out there. Here's another example of a vessel with a hull crack in it. This is not a lake vessel, this is an ocean ship, but it shows you the size of the crack that will occur in the boat. Certainly very significant. Well, post Fitzgerald, the regulatory agents, as well as the Coast Guard, stepped forward. They changed all of the design figures they had come up with in 1973, where they allowed another 4 foot of freeboard. They killed that idea completely. Technically known as invalidating the existing load line regulations. They also looked at sea state design, and sea state being another word, fancy word for being a wave. How do you predict a wave? How do you measure a wave? And how can people interpret what it really means? They looked at stability monitoring for the Great Lakes vessels, particularly with putting those monitors in certain areas on the vessel based on where they would have the most or least stress, tying them all together to a readout system in the pilot house that would allow them real-time reaction. Pre-loss. In other words, when the Fitzgerald went off on her last trip in 1975, she was fairly well equipped for the time. 3 VHF/FM radios, one of them emergency powered, 2 AM radios also for emergency use, 2 radars. Remember, both of those were knocked out by the storm. A radio direction finder, but no depth finder and no EPIRB. Now, the depth finder is quite literally the device that will tell you how much water you have under your keel. If you were operating in waters that might be shallow, like coming out of a channel, might be getting into something at Caribou Island, you probably would want to know how much water I got. They didn't have the ability to determine that because the Coast Guard did not require a depth finder. The EPIRB stands for Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. That's looks like a big milk can, heavy plastic, little antenna on top of it, some kind of a mounting system on either side of the wheelhouse. The intention is if the ship is breaking up, if the ship sinks, the EPIRBs pop to the surface, put the radio signal up to the satellite that in effect says, this is Edmund Fitzgerald, latitude, longitude, we are in trouble, SOS, SOS. and that would then alert the Coast Guard to put their rescue asset to the right location. Year after she came out, so it's 1959 season, and based on what the picture is of the pilot house of the Fitzgerald, I can estimate that she's got an autopilot on board, speed distance logs, course recorder, magnetic and gyro compasses. Good stuff to have, period stuff to have, but certainly by 1977 and 1975, there was better. And that's what you were focusing on. With the re-examination of the Fitzgerald loss, the Coast Guard began to look at doing things differently. For example, they required a depth finder for all vessels 1,600 tons or more. They required a position indicators. In this case, the Loran C came out in 1980. The Global Positioning System came out in 1990. Electronic chart plotting, updated charts now. Remember, the chart for Caribou Island was about a half-mile off. So they updated those, and they also put out the automatic identification system. This is cool. This is your way to be a judge. The AIS is a little broadcast unit on every commercial vessel in the world. That puts out the name of the vessel, the size of the vessel, the owner of the vessel, the speed of the vessel, direction of the vessel, where it's going, what its IMO number may be, when it was constructed. Anything you want to know about that boat is in that little IAS broadcast system. You can get an app for your cell phone that will show you, marinetraffic.com, where every ship in the world is. Literally every ship in the world. If you want to know about that little green dot that's sitting there in the Detroit River, you can put your finger on that little green dot in the Detroit River, and up comes the illustration of the ship and all of the data that you would want to know. You can be a judge of what's happening with the Great Lakes Fleet in your pocket. Really very remarkable. Spar deck, I mentioned, is now 11.5 feet closer to the water than when it originally came out. They figured that by the end of a year, because they had increased the carrying capacity of the ship, they carried another 4,000 tons of cargo. Very often that used to mean a bonus for the captain. If you carried more cargo in the course of a year, we would pay you more. So there was a bonus effect. Keep going through the storm. Don't worry about it, boys. We're going to make it. We're okay. Just keep the boat going. Really punching it out with the storm. We don't do that anymore. Anybody hazard a guess as the number of weather buoys that were on station when Fitzgerald sank? The answer is none. None. You know how many there are today? 57. So the one federal agency that really stepped up after the loss of Fitzgerald to do things the right way was National Weather Service. They did it. They put the buoys out. They did it quickly. They linked it into the system. That's the best broadcast system you can think of that has the real ability to impact shipping. The forecasts are terrific. They've done it all because they know what needed to be done, and human beings lost their lives, potentially because it was not a station-on system. They did the same thing with satellites. When Fitzgerald went down, there was one satellite that came out over the Great Lakes about once every 3 days. So you had very sparse information as to what was happening in terms, again, of weather forecasting and building. This is not an illustration of a Great Lakes vessel. This is a saltwater vessel. But I wanted to show you two things. One is how the water is coming across the deck and freezing to the hatches, certainly something that happens on the lakes. And also the building of the waves and how you can measure these waves in terms of scope and makeup. Shouldn't forget either that they initiated the voluntary observation ship system, where on each ship there's a volunteer member of the crew that takes at certain intervals the weather forecasting that's going on, the weather direction, the wind direction, speed direction, air temperature, all fed into the central system, again, for better forecasting. So let's go back to the sinking of the ship. Sioux Coast Guard is now on board with this Nor carrier missing. They will put the flash out to all of the available stations and equipment. They'll have an Albatross seaplane out of Traverse City to begin to look for the Fitzgerald C-130s out of North Carolina Guard, Michigan Army Guard, Canadian government C-130. They'll get a helicopter up by morning. One of the things that occurred in researching for the latest edition of my book was I stumbled across a reference to the Air Force Search and Rescue System located at K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base. Sawyer had the rescue squadron because they had a B-52 wing. They also had the tanker wing, the refuelers, and they periodically had squadrons coming in of interceptors. So they had two Hueys, twin turbines, the November models, stationed at Sawyer for crash response and et cetera. These guys got the call the night the Fitzgerald sank. They were expected to go out and try and find survivors on that hellish evening. Luckily, before they took off, they were recalled until morning. They gave them the grace of day, at least daylight, to try and make it out and see what they could find. The answer was they found no human life. They did find bits and pieces of the Fitzgerald and recovered those that they could. But when you look at the quality of courage, these guys are part of it. These guys measured up. They were going out. I talked about the EPIRBs a little while ago, but just an example of one being used today. Again, singular radio device to be able to vector and help. If you look very closely at that lower picture on your left-hand side, you see an orange tube attached to the wall of this lifeboat. The purpose of that is the same thing. It's a small EPIRB. And if anything happens to that lifeboat, either being used for the evacuate passengers from a commercial vessel, or whether she's being used to ferry people to shore, they've got this response embedded. By the way, if you want to buy your own EPIRB, the personal ones are now a little bit bigger than the pack of cigarettes. You can just clip it to your shirt and you're good to go. The Coast Guard also had significant shortfalls on the shipwreck, particularly at Whitefish Point. Whitefish Point had two things that were critical for navigation. One was the light, the big light on the tower that had been up there since 1860. And the second item was the radio direction finder that put a steady beam out onto the lake. And then if you had an RDF unit on the vessel, you'd be able to zero into that, and that would help you keep your course and where you're going. However, there was a storm that night, as we know. The storm was strong enough to knock the electric the electric cabling down that controlled both the lighthouse tower light and the radio beacon. So because the Coast Guard did not have a generator system to pick it up whenever it failed by the commercial system, those critical life-saving devices were out that night. They weren't working. Now, whether it would have made any difference to Fitzgerald, I don't know. But certainly it gives you product of thinking a little bit about it, a little harder. Coast Guard had two major vessels that could have been capable of assisting Fitzgerald, depending on situation. The icebreaker Mackinac and the buoy tender Sundew. Both of them were down in the lower lakes, which means below the Sioux, I'll get it, Sioux Locks, on planned maintenance. In other words, they had planned to take the ship's motors apart during the winter, put them back together again during the winter, in the fall. Now think about this. If you're on the Great Lakes, you have a 40% chance of having a shipwreck during the fall, probably in November. So let's do something really smart. Let's take our two big boats that are really good in rescue, and we're going to take those into heavy maintenance where they're not available for the fall. Yeah, it's kind of like this makes no sense. In many ways, this picture represents what could have been. This is the Gumby suit. This is the survival suit. This is the rescue suit. This is the same one they've been using in the Bering Sea for 10 years. Essentially, it's a neoprene suit that you can put on in 19 seconds. And I measure that 19 seconds. That's the skill qualification side of being a sailor now. You have to get your suit on in 19 seconds. It's designed to keep you alive from a hypothermic perspective. They finally made them legal. Up until 1977, they were considered to be unusable on commercial vessels. because the Coast Guard did not authorize them to be a Class A life-saving device. Instead, you were given one of these, which is a canvas life jacket. Now that makes sense. What kills you if you're in a shipwreck on the Great Lakes? What's the killer? Is it drowning or is it hypothermia? It's hypothermia. And that's what the life-saving suit was designed to prevent and did well. They also went to better checks of operational capability prior to the season, especially the heavy weather season. Now they had the Coast Guard inspectors out doing the work, not just the insurance inspectors. They also provided greater amounts of information for the ship captains, particularly loading and stability information, to better be able to manage their vessel. And they included techniques and methodology to survive flooding of a vessel. And they did better crew training. So they really stepped up the game. But my point that I will make and make again is that by remembering Fitzgerald, we not only honor her, but also all of the 6,500 Great Lakes shipwrecks. So instead of trying to do each one individually, we do them all at once with Fitzgerald. Taking that a little differently, it also introduces a note of caution to operators and crews when sailing the lakes. But there are positive reasons to remember Fitzgerald, very positive ones. And I went over the ones that were repaired since. Because here we are 50 years later, 50 years, and whatever happened to Fitzgerald has never happened again to another vessel. Whatever we did following Fitzgerald to upgrade it, to make the vessels more capable, give them more ability to, if you will, be survivable within given weather conditions, have been most successful. If you can talk to a Great Lakes sailor today and talk to him about Fitzgerald or her, it's going to be much like it just happened. Because to the Great Lakes navigator, it did just happen. It's still on their mind. It's something they think about. And it's a decision they make when they come off in the fall with that last run of the season that they will seek shelter. They will slow down. They will not try and buff the ship through, regardless of the severity of the storm. Well, that concludes what I have to say. And if you have any questions, I'll do my very best to try and answer them.
Thanks, Fred. I've got a couple questions in the chat. Martin, I see you with your hand raised, and I believe you had the first question. So if you want to go ahead and unmute.
E- Well, actually, yeah, no, yeah, I thought that question was good. Yes, for starters, I just want to know in the picture when you're talking about the out the Cedarville and the Carl D. Bradley, was that supposed to be the Cedarville or the Bradley, the picture?
Uh, Bradley was right. Bradley was correctly identified, as
All right,
was the Morel. The
all right,
Cedarville, yes, that was Cedarville.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, the real question I wanted to ask was, apart from Captain Bernie Cooper and First Mate Morgan Clark, do we know of any of the other men who were on the Arthur Anderson that night, or is there not a roster available?
I have not seen a roster to the Arthur Anderson. I was had communicated a great deal with Bernie Cooper.
All right.
Thank you.
For everybody, Bernie was the captain of the Anderson, the following boat to Fitzgerald.
I also have a question from Brian. Coming back to the broken off fence rail, there was a indication that the Evan Fitzgerald started to break in half on the surface. Was that one of the theories that was presented?
Uh, no, it is the maritime architects I've talked with indicated that if the vessel was really going to break, in other words, a snap on the surface, much as you saw with Morel, for example, the fence rails were gone right now. They didn't have the strength to hold the boat together, if that's what the thought is. And of course, it was slacked up anyway.
Let's see, we've got some thank yous coming in. I've seen some applause. Let's see. How much did a depth finder cost back then? That's a question from Rochelle.
I'm sorry, say again.
How much would a depth finder have cost back then?
I'd like to tell folks $212, available from Kmart. Um, I'm sure it would have been a more expensive model than that, but certainly when you get to navigation equipment, that's critical for any ship, and it's critical to have those products that will work for you every time. And I think it just got away from them. It got away from everybody. When you roll on back to shipwrecks every 8 years, what's going on here? And was the way they were operating the vessels. It was what they always did. The storm in 1913, right? We lose 1919. We lose 47 vessels from severe damage during the shipwreck. 9 of them are Great Lakes bulk carriers that disappear with all hands because they were punching their way through. They didn't have weather forecasting either with the Tinker's Dam. That was a weather problem, but you overstress the vessel. You know,
I have a lot of comments and questions, and feel free to, if I don't get a chance to ask all of them, I'll be happy to send them off to Fred, so that way we can get answers sent back to you after the event. Um, there was a question, was paint found on the hull of the Caribou Island?
I'm sorry, say that again.
There was a question, was there anything like documented? The person was asking, did I read what there was paint found on the hull off Caribou Island?
Um, that's that's a joke. Um, Following the wreck, the shipping company hired a company known as Neptune Marine, Dick Race. Dick had been a salvage operator on the Great Lakes for some time and was considered to be very good at it. To go out and do a check of the Caribou Shoal area and see if he could find any evidence that the ship had struck. Perhaps a scrape on a rock, perhaps some paint foul on the rocks, some indication of that. Dick did that. I knew Dick and rather saw him fairly frequently for other reasons. And in speaking with his crew, they indicated they said not a thing. The shoal was too big for any real effort to survey it, to take a look at it visually. But what they had done was not with not with any reward. In other words, there's nothing there. But you'll find little things like that around the Fitzgerald all the time, written by somebody who wants to be somebody and come up with that crap stuff.
And then again, I'm sorry if I didn't have a chance to get to your question. I will make sure that we get some answers sent to you via email since you registered for the event. But last question, did the owners of the Fitzgerald receive any negative feedback from the public?
Say that again.
Did the owners of the Fitzgerald, did they receive any kind of negative feedback from the public after the wreck?
There was no, not immediately. The negative feedback that they received, I think, really based itself on the insurance policy payouts. In other words, how much crewmen got in terms of insurance settlement. And as in always these type of cases, the captain will get the most money, captain's family, and then the crew family will get less money based on their position on the ship. And the other people that get richer are the lawyers, and of course they'll fight out because the crew is going to have the union with them, and the uh, management will have its lawyer team with them. So that was one of the bad certainly not one of the bad. I'm sounding like this loss of human life is acceptable. It is not, but that's the way it played out. Everybody had a non-disclosure agreement, so I'm not aware of any specific amounts of money beyond very general statements.
You. Thank you, Fred. This was a great presentation, very educational. Again, Fred will have a follow-up presentation on the 15th up at Michigan Tech. We hope you get a chance, if you're in the area, to stop by as well. In the meantime, we hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings and take care, everyone.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your patience and I appreciate your questions.
Thank
And
you.
I would point out that I really hate
Thank
Zoom
you.
because I find myself looking at this television screen without any idea
Oh, I know you've turned it.
what's happening out there in the real world.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it. Jim here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.